There are many countries in Africa that seem to be stuck in a never-ending cycle of coups, corruption, and chaos. But one country in particular stands out as the most chaotic: the Central African Republic. This is a nation that has never really had a moment of peace since it was formed. From foreign powers tearing the country apart at its creation to decades of civil wars, coups, and rebel groups running rampant, this country has seen more than its fair share of violence. And now, with yet another new conflict, this country seems to be on the verge of collapse once again. So in today's video, we were going to take a look at the Central African Republic and how this country has been shattered by chaos, rebels, and foreign influence. The modern Central African Republic was formed in 1960 when the French colonial empire was dismantled and decolonization swept across the continent. The Central African Republic was formed out of the former French colony of Ubangi-Shari, which included parts of present-day Chad, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Cameroon, and the Central African Republic. When the region was split up, the area around the Ubangi River, including the capital of Ubangi-Shari, became part of the newly independent Central African Republic. At independence, the Central African Republic was a mess. There were deep ethnic divisions between the two main indigenous groups, the Sangaris and the Pygmies. And to make matters worse, there was no real system of governance or rule of law. This meant that the country descended into chaos almost immediately after independence, which led the French to intervene and reassert their control over the country. The French then proceeded to install their own puppet leader and essentially turned the Central African Republic into a French protectorate once again. The French exploited the Central African Republic for its vast natural resources, particularly its gold, diamonds, and timber. They also continued to marginalize the local population, which only served to further destabilize the country. In 1976, the situation finally came to a head, and a coalition of rebel groups launched a coup against the government. The rebels were led by a charismatic military officer named Jean Bedel Bokassa, who had previously fought in the French military during the Algerian War. Bokassa seized power in a relatively bloodless coup, and he wasted no time in consolidating his power. One of his first acts as president was to change the name of the country from the Central African Republic to the Central African Empire, and to declare himself emperor. Bokassa then set about ruling the country in an increasingly authoritarian and brutal manner. He suppressed any opposition to his rule, and he embarked on a series of dubious military adventures, including an invasion of the neighboring country of the Congo. These adventures were largely disastrous, and they only served to make Bokassa even more unpopular. By the early 1980s, the situation in the Central African Empire had become so chaotic and violent that France intervened once again, and Bokassa was forced to flee to Europe. France then installed a new government in the Central African Republic, and the country was once again plunged into instability. In the years that followed, the Central African Republic would see a number of different coups and rebel groups emerge, each vying for power and control of the country's vast natural resources. But it wasn't until 2012 and 2013 that the country really descended into full-scale civil war. In March 2012, a group of soldiers loyal to former President Bokassa launched an attack on the presidential palace in an attempt to overthrow the sitting president, François Bozizé. Although the attack was ultimately unsuccessful, it marked the beginning of a larger and more serious rebellion in the country. Within months, several different rebel groups had emerged, including the Seleka and the Anti-Balaka. These groups were largely made up of young men who had been radicalized by years of propaganda and violence. They fought each other and the government forces in a brutal and bloody conflict that resulted in thousands of deaths and the displacement of hundreds of thousands of people. The fighting was particularly intense in the capital city of Bangui, where entire neighborhoods were burned to the ground. As the conflict escalated, it quickly became clear that the government of the Central African Republic was unable to protect its citizens. In fact, it was widely believed that the government was complicit in the violence, as it was essentially a proxy war between two of the most powerful countries in the region, the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Chad. The Seleka rebels were supported by the government of Chad, while the Anti-Balaka rebels were backed by the government of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. This meant that the conflict in the Central African Republic was essentially a proxy conflict between these two larger regional powers. In an effort to end the violence, the international community eventually intervened in the Central African Republic. France deployed troops to the country to try to restore order, and the United Nations sent a peacekeeping mission to monitor the situation. But unfortunately, these efforts have not been very successful, and the violence has continued to persist. One of the main reasons for this is that the rebel groups in the Central African Republic are not just fighting over territory or resources. They're also fighting over the very soul of the country. The two main rebel groups, the Seleka and the Anti-Balaka, represent two different visions for the future of the Central African Republic. The Seleka rebels are predominantly Muslim, and they want to turn the Central African Republic into an Islamic state. The Anti-Balaka rebels are mostly Christian, and they want to keep the Central African Republic as a Christian country. This means that the conflict in the Central African Republic is not just a fight for power and resources, it is also a religious war. This conflict has led to a humanitarian crisis in the country. Hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced and have had to flee to neighboring countries such as Cameroon, Chad, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The fighting has also led to a severe food shortage in the country, and many people are on the brink of starvation. In recent years, the situation in the Central African Republic has begun to improve somewhat. The fighting between the rebel groups has subsided, and the government has been able to extend its control over much of the country. However, the country is still far from stable, and new conflicts are always simmering just below the surface. One of the biggest problems facing the Central African Republic is the presence of foreign fighters on its soil. As we mentioned earlier, the conflict in the country has been largely a proxy conflict between the governments of Chad and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. This meant that both of these countries had a vested interest in continuing the conflict, and they would send in troops to fight on behalf of their respective rebel groups. The presence of these foreign fighters has only made the conflict more complex, and it has made it very difficult for the government to assert its authority over the country. Another major problem facing the Central African Republic is the proliferation of small arms. The fighting between the rebel groups has led to a massive influx of weapons into the country, and these weapons have ended up in the hands of civilians. This has created a climate of fear and insecurity throughout the country, and it has made it very difficult for people to go about their daily lives. Despite these challenges, the government of the Central African Republic is making efforts to restore order and stability to the country. In recent years, the government has launched a number of disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration programs to try to get the small arms out of circulation. The government is also working to improve relations with neighboring countries in an effort to reduce the influence of foreign fighters in the country. The future of the Central African Republic is uncertain. It is a country that has been shattered by years of conflict and instability. But the government is making efforts to restore order and stability to the country. Only time will tell if these efforts will be successful. The Central African Republic is a tragic example of a country that has been torn apart by violence and instability. From the days of French colonialism to the present day, the country has been ruled by a series of dictators and rebel groups. The people of the Central African Republic have suffered greatly as a result of this instability, and thousands of lives have been lost. The country is still struggling to find its way towards peace and stability, but there is hope that one day it can become a peaceful and prosperous nation. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.